Good morning. My name is David Legg, and I'm here with my colleagues Karen Dommett and Leticia Janzen, and it's our great pleasure to provide a recording of a presentation to the Brazilian Parasport Pedagogy Conference on Sport for Life, which is a Canadian model designed originally for able-bodied persons that has been adapted and updated for persons with disability. And we're going to focus on an initiative in Calgary, which is in Western Canada, on something called the Calgary Adapted Hub. Next slide, please. The Calgary Adapted Hub is powered by Jumpstart, which is the charitable arm of Canadian Tire, which is a very large national, originally, as the name would suggest, automotive company that has expanded into the home hardware and clothing area. It's one of the largest companies in Canada. Next slide, please. The Calgary Adapted Hub originated through the recognition that within a Calgary context, and Calgary is a city of just over 1 million people in Western Canada, right along the Rocky Mountains. So if we were driving, would be approximately 16 hours from the coast and Vancouver. And we're just north of, in the United States, of what would be the state of Montana. So in the city of Calgary, again, just over about 1 million people, there was recognition that there were great programs happening for individuals with disabilities in a variety of contexts, going from grassroots to high performance sport, but they were lacking coordination and they were lacking synchronicity and connections and connectivity to one another. And so the idea of the Calgary Adapted Hub is exactly that, insofar as a hub, in that it connects a number of existing partners. And you can see the logos of those partners there, and it's expanding, but those are the original partners. So Winsport, which was Canada Olympic Park, so Calgary hosted the 1988 Winter Olympic Games, and so that's the facility there. The MMP Community and Sports Center is just a large multi-purpose center with swimming pools and gymnasium. Vivo Center is similar to the MMP Center and is a large multi-sport community center. The University of Calgary and Mount Royal University are the two universities in Calgary, and we both have kinesiology and physical education programs, and then obviously recreation facilities. And then the two umbrella groups, Sport Calgary and the City of Calgary Recreation Departments, were the 6th and 7th partners. And then the logo on the bottom left-hand corner, the VI Riddell Pediatric Rehabilitation Research Program, is the research and knowledge translation arm of the Calgary Adapted Hub. And that's what Leticia Janzen will be speaking to in a moment. And then, of course, the already aforementioned Jumpstart logo in the bottom right-hand corner. Next slide, please. So this idea of a Sport for Life program and policy originated in the late 1990s. And going back to the 70s and 80s in Canada, Canada had the distinction of hosting Olympic Games, not Paralympic Games, but only Olympic Games. So 1976, the Summer Olympics were held in Montreal, and the Winter Games, as I mentioned earlier, were held in Calgary in 1988. And Canada had the distinction of being the only country to have hosted an Olympic Games and not won a gold medal. And we did it twice. So we did it at Montreal in 1976 and Calgary in 1988. No other country had ever done that before and has not done that since. And we did it twice. So when Canada bid to host the 2010 Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games, which were ultimately hosted in Vancouver, there was a lot of pressure at the national level to ensure that this didn't happen a third time. And so Canada wanted to invest significantly into the amateur sports system to ensure that we had gold medals. In addition to this, and for those of you that are interested in sport history, you may recall in 1988, in the Summer Olympic Games that were held in Seoul, there was a very prominent Canadian sprinter, Ben Johnson, that tested positive for anabolic steroids and arguably was the first kind of high-profile athlete to test positive for anabolic steroids. And a commission called the Dommett Commission occurred in Canada that really put a spotlight on some of the nefarious and perhaps negative things happening in sport in Canada. And it really created, decreased the amount of funding that occurred in amateur sport in the 90s following the 88 Games. And so there was this sense of we need to invest in sport because funding had decreased as a result of the Ben Johnson Dommett inquiry, in addition to the recognition that we had not won gold medals in previous games, and we wanted to do so in Vancouver when we hosted in 2010. Coupled with this were a number of social issues that were occurring within amateur sport, and I've identified a number of these below. And so this idea of adult training and competition programs superimposed on children. And I would argue that we continue to see this today, where we have academies and this idea of elite training for even the youngest of children in order to get them to the highest levels of sport, and particularly professional sport. And in a Canadian context, we see this very much with hockey as an example. This idea of peaking by Friday, and so trying to accelerate as quickly as possible. There was a Canadian author by the name of Malcolm Gladwell that popularized this idea of 10,000 hours. And if you committed 10,000 hours to training, you would ultimately become an expert in just about anything. And again, this model was superimposed from violin players in Germany and somehow, articulated in a sport context when the evidence did not support that. This idea of chronological age versus developmental age. And so again, you could have a 12-year-old that looks like an adult and is, over 6 feet tall and has the physical dimensions of an adult, and another 12-year-old who looks like they could be 9. And so developmentally, they're competing against each other, though, because they're both 12. And we've actually seen this play out from birth order effect. And so that children born in January, February, and March tend to dominate in the professional sports because they have those, that extra time to mature and be physically dominant at the youngest of ages. And then that just continues the track as people develop in the sport infrastructure. And this idea of physical literacy not being taught and only single sporting activities being focused on. And again, in the Canadian context, particularly in hockey, and this in the Brazilian context may translate to soccer or football, as you call it there. But I'm not 100% sure on that. Next slide, please. We also found, again, this is going back to the early 2000s, and it may still be continuing today, that the best coaches only worked with elite athletes. You could make the argument that the reverse should actually take place and that the best coaches should work with the youngest athletes. And as the athletes become better, coaching may be less important and valuable. And so maybe the worst coaches should be at that level. Parents were not educated about long-term development at all. Again, they were focused on trying to get their child to the big leagues, the pro sport opportunities. There was no talent identification. It was simply based on, did you win when you were a 5-year-old? And then you got put into the best category as a 6-year-old, the best category as a 7-year-old, and it created this pathway. And there was no system of integration. So the schools operated independently of community sport, the clubs, academies, etc. Next slide, please. So all this resulted in what was called at the time long-term athlete development. And so I point that out because it was designed originally to create high-performance athletes in order to win medals at the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games that were being held in Vancouver. It has evolved over time, though, to move away from athlete development and simply be long-term development for all participants. And this is where we'll see it having application within an adapted physical activity context here in Calgary. And I've included the link there for you if you wanted to pursue this further. Next slide, please. As this model evolved, it was quite an iterative process, and I've shared a couple of slides just to identify where the thinking was that led to this. And so people were trying to identify, even within the age span and age evolution, where different programs and different people evolved. And so here's just an example of kind of the roles and responsibilities that different people could play within this system, this sport for life concept. And so you'll see at the bottom the birth, going from birth to 70 plus, and at the top you can see where different groups and people may have responsibility within this system. So going from parents and community to, again, the community still being involved at the oldest participants, but individuals and clubs as well. And then in that middle zone you can see where the physical literacy, physical education piece has a predominant role, and then moving more into this idea of active for life. Next slide, please. This is a second slide that looks at, particularly for younger children, as they're growing, and the optimum times to start focusing on different elements of physical literacy. And as one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier, a lot of parents were not necessarily following these recommendations, and they were superimposing elite training programs on the youngest of ages. And so you can see here, anyways, the thinking being that at certain times, as children are reaching physical maturation, those were the key opportunities to focus on different skill development, fundamental motor skills, and not to do them prematurely. Next slide, please. And so another example, again, of kind of how this philosophy or model evolved over time. And this one was getting closer to the final model, which I'll show to you in a few seconds. And so you can see here that we were moving away from this focus on elite performance. And so you can see that purple triangle on the left-hand side is really, really quite small compared to the rest of the model. And so this recognition that this idea of high performance sport was still important, but in the grand scheme of things was really significantly smaller than the rest, and that it was that red active for life and this idea of being a participant and involved in sport and recreation for the lifespan that really was the largest group of individuals that we should be focusing on. So over time, this model evolved from focusing on elite athlete performance to one of active for life. Next slide, please. And so this is the one really where we kind of ended at. And how this has application within an adapted physical activity context is, again, remember that this model was designed primarily for able-bodied individuals initially, and it was thought to be adaptable within a disability context. What happened, though, is those two categories on the bottom right-hand corner were new and created specifically for the purposes of including an individual with a disability. And I have inadvertently and mistakenly used an old model because the terminology actually in the bottom right-hand corner is no longer being used either. And so the first one is awareness. And so as you can only, and I would presume this would be in a Brazilian context as well, if a parent doesn't know about the opportunities that exist in their local context for their children to participate in Learn To programs, in multi-sport programs, they're not going to be able to access because they don't even know they are there. Within an able-bodied context, it's much easier because you have a bigger population base by which to promote and to share these opportunities, to get them into the public discourse and to let parents know that, oh, this Learn To hockey program, this Learn To soccer/football program is available. But in a disability context, that's much harder to do, to market and to send information directly to the consumer. So this idea of awareness was superimposed onto the Canadian Sport for Life model specific to disability. The second one, first contact, actually the terminology for that has changed, although really the idea has not. And this idea of first contact was changed because it had a negative insinuation related to the colonization of Canada from a European context and our First Nations, Indigenous, Aboriginal persons. So this idea of first contact, again, had this negative implication that the Europeans had arrived, had first contact with the Aboriginal, Indigenous persons. And so the terminology has since changed, although the idea really behind it is not within this context of Canadian Sport for Life. And really what this is trying to say is that if a child with a disability comes to a sport program, that first initiation, that first relationship with a coach, with peers, with the facility has to be welcoming, and it has to provide a sense of potential and possibility. Otherwise, the odds of them returning for a second and third time are not very good. And it was thought that these two things were importantly different within a disability context than they were in an able-bodied one, hence why they were included. And as far as the rest of the model goes, you can see that those bottom three colors, the Learn to Train, the fundamentals, and the active start, that's where a focus on physical literacy takes place. And so it's not on sports specific. You're not becoming a hockey player. You're learning to run and jump and throw and catch. And you're doing so in a variety of contexts: on land, in air, on water, and in a Canadian context, on ice. Once you've developed through that physical literacy phase, then you go into the excellent phase, if you wish, on the left-hand side, where you're learning to train to train. And so at the ages of 12 and 13, you're understanding the principles and the opportunities of how to train as, you know, potentially an elite athlete. You then are training to compete, but you're only doing that after you've learned how to train. And then the final, the little kind of triangle there is training to win. And again, comparatively speaking, that's not a big part of the population. So this model really evolved to one where it looked primarily at being active for life and fit for life. And then again, that orange stream in the middle there is perhaps competitive for life. And you could probably argue that many of us fit now in that competitive for life and the active for life. So I went golfing yesterday. I was trying to be competitive. I wasn't very competitive. And so I could probably argue that I was active for life, but in my own mind, I wanted to be more competitive for life yesterday, but it just didn't pan out. Next slide, please. Now, the creation of this model was not done without a number of challenges, but also opportunities. And I've listed a lot of them there, but I won't go through each of them. The biggest, I think, is this idea of inertia and momentum. And so trying to change the attitudes of a system that has taken decades to be created is not easy. And in many cases, we're going against, old school wisdom of how to prepare athletes that can compete at the highest levels and represent our country and make sure that particularly again in ice hockey that we are the very world's best. And so it's not a process that's without its challenges, but it's one that we are still continuing to pursue. Next slide, please. As with anything, when there are challenges, there are also great opportunities. And so I think, again, I won't go through all of these. The ones that I think I would focus on, though, is the opportunities for greater connectivity and a systems approach to providing opportunities for individuals, and specifically for those with disabilities, so that they know that if, I learned to do this sport, then maybe I can go do this sport. I can become more involved with my parents or my siblings or my friends in more of a recreational aspect. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to Leticia, who's our Research and Knowledge Translation Coordinator of the Calgary Adapted Hub. And what we've committed to, and the Calgary Adapted Hub is only 2 years old now in our existence, and we've committed to trying to create programs and services that are based on evidence and are evidence informed, and so that we are not just using anecdotes and our own intuition in order to continue programs, but that we're making a concerted and a long-term commitment to this idea of research and knowledge translation. And how this all fits within a sport for life model, where we go from the earliest, youngest children developing physical literacy and ultimately and hopefully becoming active for life. So I'll turn it over to Leticia now.
Thank you, Dr. Legg. So as Dr. Legg mentioned, we are running research, integrating it within programs within our Calgary Adapted Hub program partners. To date, we have 4 ongoing-ish projects. The first one I'll discuss briefly is our COVID-19 impacts project. So we were looking to understand how physical activity and social connections were impacted by the pandemic, specifically for youth who experience disability. What we did is semi-structured interviews. We had 13 youth and 7 parents participate in the study. The parents did the best that they could to share the impact that the pandemic had on their child's life, because their child was nonverbal or unable to communicate how the pandemic had impacted them specifically. We've had the opportunity to submit this paper, and it is currently under revision, so hoping for good news there. Next slide, please. Second study we have ongoing is a project that was looking at how staff training influence the confidence, competence, and motivation of staff as they were working with persons with disabilities. Some of our program partners have had plenty of experience working and offering adapted or inclusive programming. Others are just getting into it as part of our new, I can't say new, but 2 years into our collective for the Calgary Adapted Hub. And so we wanted to understand, what role training these staff and providing different levels of training had on the staff as they get involved. So we had 3 types of training to offer. One was more directed towards management. One was directed towards those who were working in the front lines, actually actively engaging with individuals with disabilities. And one was a little bit more generic, open to everyone, but again, it had that, frontline kind of feel to it. For the study, we looked at a baseline measure, trying to understand where people were before their training in terms of how they felt in terms of their confidence, competence, and motivation, and how this changed immediately following training, 6 months and 12 months following. We are currently reviewing the data for this study. So next slide, please. Next study I'll talk about is an adapted physical activity survey. So what we're looking to do is understand what the injury and concussion burden are in adapted and inclusive sports. Typically in the past, this has been looked at high levels and not really looked at in terms of even grassroots level of play. So what we're trying to do is include as many adapted inclusive programs across Canada, and understand how many individuals in these sports, whether they have a disability or not, have experienced injury, have experienced concussion, how they've experienced those, the impact it's had on them. So our survey is still underway. Next slide, please. And the final study I'll talk about is one that we directly integrate into every program that the Calgary Adapted Hub is supporting in any way, shape, or form. And we're looking at physical activity levels, self-perception, and motivation as it relates to physical activity. We want to build in measures for independence and function. We've got measures for quality of life, and we'll build in mental health into that soon as well. We're looking at quality of participation, injury risk through the survey. We're going to build in healthcare utilization, and we're currently looking at what experiences lead to sustained participation through a qualitative project. Building this in to each program is a really good opportunity to have participants get more engaged and understand, how their own physical activity levels or how their own perception of their participation is changing over the course of a year as they are introduced to more programs. So thank you. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Leticia. So my name is Karen Dommett, and I am the Director of Programs and Services with the Calgary Adapted Hub. So I'll just speak on a little bit of proof points of some of the programs that we've been able to execute. So as Leticia mentioned, we have an integrated research and knowledge translation model where we are embedding research and evidence collection or data collection into all of our programs so that we're informing the future creation of our programs based on evidence. We also integrate knowledge translation with a community advisory committee. So we live very true to the notion that we're building with people with disabilities, not for people with disabilities, ensuring that the perception and lived experience of an individual with a disability is ingrained in every process. The purpose of our collective is that we are developing pathways of participation through intentional program design. So working in a collective partnership really allows us to map out the ecosystem and facilitate how we are achieving that sport for life model. So we'll share a few examples. Our partner WinSport runs a adapted multi-sport program every Sunday afternoon where they bring in a different community partner who specializes in an adapted sport. It's a free program open to all ages and all abilities. And so it really allows for a family participation to bring friends or siblings to come participate and be introduced. So going back to David's slides of that bottom tier of first contact and awareness, and the role we also play is through program navigation and supporting families so that they are aware of what programs exist in the community. So once they attend a program like the WinSport multi-sport program, they're offered exposure to a number of different adapted and disability inclusive sports. And then they're also put directly in contact then with those programs that offer that sport. So whether it's wheelchair basketball or here in Canada, sledge hockey or para ice hockey. There's also a number of sports that are focused for individuals with coexisting disabilities or cognitive impairments or intellectual disabilities. So not always specific to just physical disabilities. Some other examples of pathways of participation, Dr. David Legg is also the founder of a program at Mount Royal University called CAPA. It's the Children's Adapted Physical Activity Program. So again, really rooted in that early exposure, multi-sport, active play, first initiation contact. And what that then exposes kids to is lots of gymnasium games, wall climbing, aquatics, and then they're connected with the Calgary Adapted Hub to then arm them on their pathway of participation, so that if their participation enjoyment was through the aquatics program, then we're able to connect them with adapted swimming lessons through our other partners, or a competitive para swim program with another partner. This can lead to then the development of a para triathlon program with another one of our community partners, who then is able to also work with a adapted hand cycling organization, because they may not have the expertise or specialization in adapted hand cycling, but they're well equipped in guided running or para swimming. So we really find that that is the power of our collaboration, is that we are travel companions and pathfinders, not only for the families, but also the organizations that we work with. We understand that creating adaptive or disability inclusive programs is not something that everyone is used to or comfortable with. So we are also that resource bank to help guide them on that pathway to become more inclusive and accessible. So I will end my portion here with just this one photo of a new program that we just launched, which is really an innovative initiative of taking one of our national sports, our summer national sport is lacrosse, and turning it now into an adapted version. So we now have here in Calgary wheelchair lacrosse. And we really firmly believe that sport has the power to be someone's safe place in their home through the continuum of their life. And when we create more inclusive and safe places through sport, we have the power to influence the rest of our culture and society. Oh, sorry, David, you're just on mute there.
Thank you, Karen. That concludes the formal portion of our presentation. And I am happy to connect with delegates if they have further questions or comments. You can see our website there, as well as our social media options by which to connect with us. And we would certainly encourage you to do exactly that. Obrigado, and we look forward to staying connected. Thank you.